The ritual abuses for the Antichrist actively infuses itself into the scientific functions of the world parasite, Genova from Final Fantasy VII, and its creation of the world parasite Sephiroth, which then mechanizes the activity by its radicalization process, where the world parasite either eats its child or its child eats it, and therefore generates the posterities, increased strength and superiority, and thus the preservation of the genes. And to this end, you have the mechanism actively grow and facilitate to that extortion, and thus you must destroy and kill the man by any means necessary in order to create the parasite, in order to create the devil. And in the manufacturing of the devil, you must abuse them for that ritual function of making the devil in the opposition of the existence of the devil, and thus be the source of your own demise. And to the end that that becomes the mechanism, the active function against the general public from these infections materializes the activity of their harassment and abuse and opposition and force and violence and contempt on the basis of the thing that they are creating, and the action of the opposition to the thing that they are creating merely requires them to sit back and do nothing in order to protect themselves from it. Their action to defend themselves is a suicidal self-harm activity manufactured for their injury by their enemies, who, being a super minority of super predators, requires them to be the source of their own injury. Lest they fail the insurrection, the majority must engage in the self-harm, in the Faustian deal with the devil, and thus, to this extent, the hyper-radicalization of the general public and the creation of communists, the targeting of community leaders, such as church leaders or those who are influencing communities that are being abused, such as the black community, and its leaders, having been traumatized into this function, breaks them down until they comply with the function of the world parasites, rewritten history for them, and thus the action of incorporation of the white supremacists and their communism, such as the creation of the black community's communism or black supremacy, which is derivative of the cultural defects, and the cultural defects derived from that system, acknowledged by many of their particular important people, like Denzel Washington, acknowledged that it's not anything except for self-harm. And to that extent is the proof of the mechanism that they have been traumatized into the Soviet position of demoralization, which means even seeing reality, being forced to, against their will, with all of the proofs that could be made, still reject it in favor of the function of their delusion, and to this end engage in the function of a time bomb, automated eradication of themselves and of their community as they work for their enemies. The exceptions and loopholes and subversions which they would be provided by their enemies would be amplified infinitum until they wish themselves into destruction. As it is said in Greek mythology, if the gods want to punish mortals, they give them what they ask for, as their lack of wisdom and self-indulgence creates the function of their delusions and distractions and mismanagements as they systemically collapse themselves, and thus become the mechanism of their own demise according to the hybrid warfare, which does not require them to do a single thing against the person except let them ruin their lives, their own damn selves, which is specifically referred to in the mechanism of rape culture, as the Me Too movement is derived by the insanities derived by the female insanity, hyper exaggerated by the female Gnostics, who engage in the function of their feminist incorporated operations, seek to exploit and infinitely collapse the political influence of all women in favor of their particular luxury, with the white supremacists who hate women, and thus their delusional abuse relationship, similar to the demon lord of the abyss in D&D, Graz'zt, which then manufactures the hyper-chaos mechanism of their superiority in that mechanism of their indulgence, according to their unique acquired tastes, as they pursue the dominatrix and fully engorge themselves in the entire luxuries derived by these particular strange new attractions, as pain becomes pleasure, and thus the mechanism of self-harm as an act of indulgence. They whore themselves to the nations until they are paying their customers for their whoredoms, as they are collapsed into place without the capacity of restoring themselves, requiring a supernatural action to free them from their own inherent inferiorities derived by their mortal weakness. And to this system, you actively have their surveillance mechanisms and manipulations of the body and of the mind, creating illusions for that communism, generating the rape culture of that Me Too, facilitating these luxuries amongst their self injuries, and to the pursuit of these false moralities, which makes them feel a certain kind of way in that perpetual delusion which they themselves did not choose and was forced on them by the rapist, which then separated them from the projected original associations. And those relationships, having been stripped from them, creates a fiction of their vulnerability, similar to the light blue helmets of the Soviet Union and the Gulag Archipelago, which, by definition, merely cast a spell, and under the corruption of that system of the demoralized, lawless anarchists engage in the function of that communism, as the function of the abuses requires the sexuality as a paid service, and thus the mechanism of the person as a slave and not as a person does not get to choose, and thus the action of their prostitution by their pimp, who, having cast the spell, has full control over them, and having conducted this mechanism by fraudulent arguments, such as experiments in the right over their body, means that their body is the possession of their pimp and not of themselves, and thus they, for all time in perpetuity, are their property under the Confederate slave raids as their personal slave to enjoy at their own luxuries, and may, upon maturity, be discarded with contempt, with the fraudulent reactions that, self-doubted, engage in the function of the person's coerced speech in order to make them say it themselves, or make it look like it as they're overpowered, as they generate these false records, materializes the function of these self-supported delusions, materializing the function of their captivity, and to this extent the mechanism of having to convince their rapists that they were always in love with them, and thus the action of certain benefits from the narcissistic abusers, who, by definition, engaging the function of all kinds of flattery, engage in these entrapment schemes, and thus the attention being enormously attractive by comparison to the crafted market, so that even they could seem entertaining, might endure themselves to this function until they find themselves trapped, as the latch has collapsed itself, and they are dumped into the water, as some passerby customer has thrown the ball and hit the target, dropping their seat into the sink. Wet, discouraged, unattractive, and entirely flustered, has engaged in themselves in the function of their own captivity, and now have no way out. And it was entirely their fault. Or was it? And yes, and no, and every kind of confusing thing as they go back and forth in their destabilized mind, trying to figure out what the thing was, and the function becomes, in reality, that it is yes and it is no, as the function of having convinced them makes it their fault, and the function of them being overpowered is not their fault. And to this end, those that would have rescued them, having been provided to them, gave them a means to not suffer the injustice, and to that extortion becomes the mechanism of their self-injury, and having ignored it, becomes inflicted. And to this extent, you have those mechanisms which have to be actively promoted for the satanic rituals to have seeded into themselves, that upon the proper examination, it is all of their fault, and yet it is not actually all of their fault. But in practice, they could have escaped at the primary checkpoint if they had put in the effort, which most of them would not, and thus the action of the condemnation of the solution in reality in favor of the solution in delusion becomes the function of their entrapment. And to this extent, they must make the solution in reality the devil itself, and thus spurn their hatreds for every kind of irrational flailing, that they might justify to themselves their contempt, that upon maturity they might say that it is entirely their own fault, and that they had poor choices. And while they did not have materially poor choices, according to that specific ritual, it, according to the illusion, having been drugged by the illusion and the manipulations, the sounds having hacked their nerves and created stirrings within inside of themselves, might materially feel this way, and being themselves attractive in their own sense, create the function of that encouragement, which then materially spurs on those rapists, which then materially makes them uncomfortable, and thus the mechanism of the solution is spurned from the continuation of that mislabeling. These mechanisms of mental manipulation, such as mind control, using Galvanic Vestibular Stimulation, or GVS, which is a mechanism used by double agents in the government loyal to the Confederacy, which, as white supremacist radicals, facilitate the function of hate crimes through the KKK contracts, materializing the mechanisms of the payment, facilitating their particular markets of criminal espionage, and thus the advancements of profits on the basis of the criminal contracts, which then continue in our trade on the basis of themselves, and thus the foundation of rape culture is perfilated as their foundational currency. And it, having been hyper-exacerbated, creates the function of the tensions, which then generates the function of the reaction in the market, and thus the action of the criminal market, materializing the increased false morality of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, facilitate the activity that the false crimes might be overly expensive, that in the production of them, without the prosecution, as they have the prosecutors in their pockets, materializes the function of its existence, and thus the news reporting on it, and thus the mechanism of it always being a problem and requiring government funds in order to fight, creates the most amount of contracts at the highest prices, which is the opposite of the problem, and thus the action of it becoming the problem is the process of making it wealthy, is the process of making it important, is the process of making it inescapable. And thus you cannot win the war on drugs because the ones fighting it are the distributors. It's like the FBI with James Comey and the child porn distribution scandals. The function is that the government is the one that's guilty. And in that function of pursuing those types of policies, they've generated California as a second federal government, as a distribution of the white supremacists, conquering of the other states, as they engage in the function of historic radicalizations, creating the function of dormant viruses for the white supremacy in order to arbitrarily be radicalized upon random signals, generating the function of the phantom cells operating in these functions. And this materially, being an extension of the terror factory, materializes the function of terrorists approved of by the insurgents, which generates the function of the guaranteed distribution of those criminal operations, which being an extension of the project Paperclip and Overcast is the material ingestion of the Nazis, which was created by that very same Confederate insurgency that Lindsey Graham said had to be protected, which then materializes the function of creating the Great Depression, which funded the Nazis under the false contracts that they weren't able to use them for war equipment, and thus did not prosecute or stop paying them when they did it, because the agreement was to do the Holocaust and to do the Second World War, which they wanted to force the Americans into, and thus the creation of the isolationist state of the United States facilitated the extraordinary traumas, and thus the mechanism of requiring the function, and thus the creation of the Great New Deal, and thus the creation of the escape from poverty under the false thing, which generated the extension of the Great Depression, and thus the mechanism of the Great Dust Bowl, created by the Great New Deal, which then materializes the extraordinary frustrations and exhaustions, collapsing the people's capacity to resist the function, needing a war in order to escape the function, and thus the action of war being the solution was always the fake solution in order to fight the Nazis created by the ones who says that this is the only solution, and thus the creation of Pearl Harbor, which is then an attack by the Japanese, created by the function of the refusal to have traded at extraordinarily cheap prices of the farmers' goods, which were then collapsed, forcing the Japanese to engage into conflicts as a obligation of collection of resources, and thus the action being self-harm, and thus the action of Pearl Harbor being an exacerbation by the Japanese being exhausted into place, creates the function of the trigger, which creates the great outrage, which then materializes the function of the combination of all parts, forcing them into a war against their will, as the civilians do not control the government, which is infected by the insurrectionists, and thus enemies of the United States being in control of the government, materialize the function of it having been captured, preventing the function of any remedy to Confederate magic, and thus the mechanism of slavery and its arbitrary abuses, such as the fake experiments, which, ignoring the constitutional right to be secure in your own body, would stop those experiments, which the Constitution has ordered, which is ignored by those who do not follow the Constitution, under the demoralizing system of the Soviet Union, which, having infected the United States with its demoralizing process, created the radicalization of the Confederacy for the white supremacist communism. and thus the delusion that Congress or any other targeted party, according to the protocols of Leonardo Zion, would be considered themselves the people and not the representatives of the people, and thus the position of them having a sense of haughty arrogance and superiority materializes themselves as their own special unit of a Soviet, and thus the Wizards Council materializes the function of the ignoring of every kind of limit specifically ordered to it as American government, and thus the action of ignoring it in perpetuity for the pursuit of their own delusions for white supremacy, as they collapse further and further into the madness, the chaos of evil. They are evil, exponentially, unforgivably evil. And it's not entirely their fault, because they're so insufferably stupid. And because they are stupid, they become evil. And because they're evil, they become stupid in a negative spiral that cannot be controlled, as under chaos, they do not have the order, the strength, or fortitude to stand their structure solid and to sit up properly. They have no strength within inside themselves, except to the manipulation of others, creating more chaos, until all is dissolved into the gooey mess of their lord and master, Jublex. The mechanisms of fraud from the human trafficking includes the blocking of evidence on the basis of active investigation as a fraudulent argument from a bill of attainder and ex post facto, materializing the capacity similar to the function of how they're attempting to conduct their leverage against Trump into the means of their perpetual harassment against the general public, holding the person instead of giving them the quick trial that they're owed or to release them, the function of perpetually having them testify against themselves in the violation of the Fifth Amendment, increasing the function of them coming up with a way of prosecuting a person, and thus they have a person in search of a crime. And to the extent that they have their man, eventually they'll come up with a crime. And eventually, from this process, which is strictly prohibited by the Constitution, you have the mechanism of their separation from the congressional oversight, materializing the function of their disconnection of the authority of the Constitution, as they are not Americans. And to this extent, you have the act of contempt for Congress, which, having been infiltrated by double agents, has actively been telling them that they have no reason to respect Congress, as Congress will not be able to do anything in David's absence, similar to the function of 9/11 is the problem, and thus the action of the abuses against him generates the function of the malicious retaliation against David in order to prevent his security, in order to materialize the damages which they have planned, and thus the action of Congress being ignored, derived by David's absence, creates the contempt acknowledged by the general system in this uh, peeling away of the authority until it is sold into the executive, which is then sold to the adversary nation proper in the right to conquest. And thus the action of 9/11 being derived by a conspiracy of Middle Easterners is derived by the function of the United States war against the Soviet Union in the proxy conflicts in the Middle East, which then created the function of their hyperinvestment into the terrorists, and thus the mechanism of the quote of Dave Smith, if you want to know who we're going to fight next, look at who we're supporting now. And thus the action of the deal with the devil creates the function of the radicalization and the discarding of the radicals once the matured thing has been acquired, and thus the mechanism of not having to deal with them suffers them to progress, and thus the action of the consumption and thus the energizing from the food materializes the luxurious advancement of the coup. Strengthens, so too their damages and eccentricalities. And to that end, the mechanism of those parties, such as the Taliban, which had gone to the Congress seeking in the war on terror against 9/11 attacks, sought to make an alliance to assist the United States, which it had already had an understanding or partnership with, as it had already had its active contacts in the CIA from the Confederacy of the white supremacist Communism, materializing the function of that active contact. They were under the misconception that the United States was supporting them, and thus the action of not using, extorting, and discarding them until it is revealed to them that they were in fact there to be discarded, and thus the action of betrayal and alliances makes them look worse and worse each time the alliance is generated for the betrayal, which then materializes the function of the retaliation, and the action of the communists is the reaction of the target, and thus the action of the terrorist organizations, quote unquote, materializes the function of the hyper-accentuation of the objective of the white supremacists, who are their slave masters. And to this extent, you have the mechanism of the consistent funding, such as in the Obama era, which materializes the function of ISIS, who was created exclusively by the United States, and thus the action of hyper-funding them in the depositing and leaving of massive resources for them, such as major vehicles or gold and oil and cash pallets. And thus this action, having been a normalized function, includes the function of having overthrown Afghanistan with the misnomer that they would have broken the equipment, and thus the action of the equipment being fixable or rickshawed materializes the function of the majority of it actively being together and capable of being rebuilt, and thus the action of having left the Afghanistan military neutered without its proper security functions and capacities and technologies, under the false argument that they don't want to do that again, which is the function of having supported them in the first place, which, having supported the Afghan government, betrayed it, and thus proved the thesis that our enemies are whoever we've been supporting, and thus the action materializes into the full frontal circulation of these structures of alliances and betrayal. Your service is to your enemy, ready to devour you. It is said that JFK wanted to stop the war in Vietnam, and thus was assassinated, and thus the action of the war being continued in opposition to the hierarchy of the United States being derivative of the Confederate insurgency not being American, and thus the action of ignoring its hierarchy is the status quo. To this extent, you have materialized the function of the Confederates winning by espionage what they could not by direct force, and thus the queerification of the United States military as they purge all forms of masculinity and replace it with toxic femininity, and materialize it as a premier status quo, that they, not understanding what masculinity is or manhood in any way, are left perpetually guessing, randomly flailing in each direction in what could possibly be the thing which they would always miss. And the manufacture of all of these events culminates in the function of the Confederate insurgency under its communist magic, materializing the function of pushing out the security and replacing it by its insurrections. At which point all threats derived by the insurrections under the radicalization process of the communism creates the material threats against the general public, as their goal is to create the queerification of the normal and normalization of the queer. They need radicals in order to promote the function, and thus the action of putting them in danger becomes necessary in the radicalization ritual process, at which point they then flee to the insurgency who has been abusing them and actively condemn, deride, and diminish the function of the security. At which point the aristocracy, that's those who demand the death of the patriarchy for is necessary to their security, becomes completely cut off from the capability of protecting them making them vulnerable, as their actions towards avoiding the injury is running straight into the threat and entrapping themselves, becoming consumed by their own incompetence, and thus, by definition, it is, technically speaking, entirely their fault. The mechanisms of hybrid warfare by the anarcho white supremacists, having infiltrated the United States military, FBI, and others, have actively used the leverage from those special privileges, materializing the function against the host as a parasite, conducting an infectious disease, creating the immune system's inability to attack the alien function, and thus is tricked into defending the enemy of the host, materially creating a detrimental system that is traumatizing it until it materially dies. And to this extent, the subject becomes the use of all of these malicious secret weapons to create complications until failure, including the function of all of the illusions from the rape culture, as each party is redirected into the predetermined contract conclusion written for them by the communism of the white supremacists, at which point the materialization of the final fantasy breeds to a conclusion, killing all who participated, creating a complete wipe, and eradicating the life throughout the system for having ignored those fatal functions, and having engaged in the function of the subversion, proving the malicious end, creates to itself the evidence of the failure, which is perpetually recycled, and the system creating the trick from that immune system subversion creates the function of the defenses even turning against the necessary mechanism in the reshuffled cycling, materially creating a position where the more you invest into your defenses, the more vulnerable you become, and thus materially engage in the over reliance in the unreliable, creating a population collapse, devastating the function that you were desperately trying to defend because of your inability to subvert the insurgent infection. To these ends, the ignoring of those privileges becomes necessary to national security and your own self-defense, which, being viewed with contempt, means that you will be charged with criminal subversions by the act of defending yourself, no matter how benign. But the mere act of claiming that it is your body and not theirs is the thing that they will view with extreme malice, hatred, and retaliation.